Hi, everyone. Welcome to Foresight's Biotech and Health Extension Group, sponsored by 100 Plus Capital. It's really nice to see so many of you here. Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by Jennifer Garrison, whom I had the pleasure to meet in person very recently. And you gave a really wonderful presentation that has very little to do, I think, with most of the topics that we discussed today. But maybe we can get into that as well during the Q&A for a little bit. Let's see. As a reminder, for people who are in the Bay Area or actually even in Europe that should work too. We have Vision Weekends coming up. Vision Weekends is our annual member gathering where we gather basically the folks that have been with us through the entire year, our fellows, our top keynotes, mentors, and so forth, for like an extravaganza in the US and in France, where we basically review all of our different focus areas and see what kind of like technological advances were possible in that year, how we can prepare better for the next year, how we can drive these technologies to positive futures. So if you're interested in looking a little bit beyond your immediate technological field, then this one may be of interest to you. I'm saying this to this group because there are sponsor and patron tickets, but there's also subsidized attendance application. And so we are able to give significant subsidized tickets away. And it's usually a really wonderful way for at the end of the year to come together and to peek a little bit beyond your individual field of interest. I'm going to share more about this in the chat, and it's also on our website. If you're interested in joining, if you have questions, let me know. But it's usually, I think, a really welcome opportunity for people in this group to come together. Okay, cool. Then without further ado, let's hop into today's sessions. I'm really happy to be joined by Jennifer Garrison from the Buck Institute. So relatively local to San Francisco, and she'll be discussing reframing health and aging through the lens of reproductive longevity, which is a topic that finally is getting a little bit more attention than before, which is still not enough, but that's why we have you here to change it. So thank you so much for joining us. Your work has really been, I think like paradigm shifting in this area, and thanks for really like putting this field on the map. And we're really excited to hear what you have to tell us. And I'll be in the chat monitoring questions and excited for the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Let me know if you can't hear me. And I'm going to show my slides. Tell me if you can see everything. Does it look right to you?
Looks great.
Okay. And I'm going to hide this floating meeting controls. Okay. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm really excited to talk to this particular audience. And I would love for this to be mostly discussion. So I'm going to go through my slides fairly quickly, and we can come back and revisit anything that you want to cover in the discussion. So first of all, my disclosures: I sit on several SABs. I'm a co-founder of a company, and I was a consultant for Gamito, which is a company in this space back last fall. So I'm at the Buck Institute. I'm a faculty member there. I have a lab. I'm going to spend exactly like 1.5 minutes telling you about what we do in my lab. But if you're ever in the Bay Area, please let me know and come visit us. We're about 25 miles north of San Francisco in Novato, and it's actually a beautiful site, really worth visiting. And the Buck Institute is and of course, most of the people in this audience will know we're an independent research institute that focuses solely on understanding mechanisms of aging. Let's see if I can get this to work. So my lab, I'm a neuroscientist by training. My PhD was in chemistry and chemical biology, and I really focus my attention on bioactive peptides. And so the part of the brain that I care about most is the hypothalamus. This is really where the center for all of the neurons that control homeostasis are located, and they control all sorts of different aspects of homeostasis. And I think about this really as a master regulator for systemic aging. And that is because all of the age-associated macroscopic decline that we observe in humans, the earliest hallmarks of aging are really governed by the hypothalamus. And there's an age-related increase specifically in inflammation in this brain region. And so we think about any of the cellular and circuit mechanisms that are operating here as potential targets for anti-aging interventions. And so when you think about, for example, one of the earliest hallmarks of aging, which is reproductive decline in females, the neurons here in the hypothalamus are controlling those circuits. And one of the cool things about this brain region is that it's one of the most neurochemically diverse parts of the brain, and it makes and uses a lot of chemicals that are important for long-range signaling, including neuropeptides. So this is really what my lab works on, is trying to understand how this kind of long-distance signaling, we think about it sort of like the brain's Wi-Fi, changes with age. So there's this ongoing conversation between the brain and the rest of the body that's mediated by these neuromodulators. And we want to understand both at a circuit level and also at a specific chemical level, how those conversations change with age, with the idea that if we can figure out what's changing, we could potentially intervene there. So we do a lot of work and all of that. And I'm going to switch gears now. I just wanted to very quickly tell you what we work on. But in general, we've all seen this graph before, this functional decline that happens across organ systems during aging. And of course, it's not happening exactly synchronously, but in general, um, most of your age-related decline is happening after your fourth or fifth decade. And what falls off of this, though, in a really dramatic way, is female fertility. So aging in ovaries and other reproductive organs really happens decades before aging in the rest of the body. And although women tend to live longer than men on average, they spend a lot more of their lives in poor health. So they're also more likely to suffer from Alzheimer's disease, from long COVID, from osteoporosis. And in general, we understand some of why this is, but it's really, this reproductive decline that happens to a woman in the middle of her life is governed by a decline in ovarian function. And while men also undergo a reproductive decline with age, it's much more synchronized with the rest of the aging in their other tissues. So it's really very different what happens in women. And I think a lot of people don't realize that female humans are born with all of the eggs that they'll ever have. So around 26 weeks gestation, a female fetus has all of the eggs she's ever going to have. So what that means in practice is that even though I was born in the 70s, the egg that I came from was made in my grandmother's womb in 1956. So it's something that I think a lot of people don't realize. And this is a graph that many people are familiar with, and it's showing essentially a decline over time in not just the number of eggs that a woman has, but also the quality of those eggs. And this graph really represents an average. And so by the time a female human is born, that number has gone from 6 or 7 million that they started with to about 1 million at birth. And then this number declines pretty precipitously, so that by the time a woman goes through puberty, that number's dropped to around 300,000. And then every month with every cycle, the number of eggs that are lost is around 1,000. So 1,000 per cycle are lost. And that goes down until finally, when a woman runs out of eggs and her ovaries stop functioning, that's what we call menopause. So we really don't understand how this works. We don't understand where along this trajectory the causal cue or timer or constellation of cues and timers that govern reproductive decline happens. But what we do know is that ovaries really are aging decades before other tissues. So when a woman is in her late 20s, early 30s, her ovaries are already considered aged by the medical community. And that's really at a time when the rest of her tissues are functioning at peak performance. So as we're thinking about it now, the Buck Institute, all of the aging researchers that I know are really focused around trying to extend health span, to extend the number of years that someone is healthy. And as we make progress in extending healthy longevity, I think if we don't address reproductive longevity in women, then we're going to make gender inequality worse and not better. And that's because, as females born today have a projected lifespan of almost 100 years, what that means, because the average age of menopause hasn't changed much for decades, is that soon women will be living more of their lives after menopause than before. And that's dramatic because menopause has a really profound effect on a lot of different health parameters. So setting aside fertility, which obviously we're all familiar with, that age-related decline in reproductive function in women has effects on birth defects, infertility problems, and things like that. There's this health component that's so important. Ovaries make a whole cocktail of reproductive hormones that are so important for overall health. So going through menopause essentially dramatically increases the risk of all of these different disorders that I've listed here, among among others, heart disease, stroke, weight gain, osteoporosis. It's really dramatic. And so on a societal level, we think about this as affecting every aspect of a woman's life, whether or not a woman wants to have biological children. The fact that she's going to go through this reproductive decline in midlife really impacts every decision that someone makes during adulthood. So we really do think about this as an issue of equality, and I think that in terms of reproductive aging, this is something that we can no longer ignore. There's also evidence that menopause accelerates reproductive biological aging at a cellular level. So this paper from Morgan Levine showed that it speeds up cellular aging by at least 6%. There's also some really interesting things that we observe but don't understand the underlying causes for. So a woman's reproductive span, or the age at which she goes through menopause, is correlated with her overall lifespan. So women who go through menopause later tend to live longer. And this extends to their male brothers, which means that there's a genetic component here which has implications for aging both in men and in women. And we do spend a lot of time thinking about how understanding why ovaries age prematurely will give us clues about aging in other tissues. So, a lot of the pathways that we know about that operate in aging in other tissues are also operating in ovaries. Humans are also very odd in that there aren't very many species of animal that go through true menopause. So, there's us, 4 species of whale, and that's pretty much it. There are some species of non-human primates that have some aspects of menopause, but not others. Certainly, most animals go through reproductive decline towards the end of their lives, but this is usually much more synced up with aging in the rest of their tissues. So when I talk to people about this, typically their first question is, why don't we understand this? Like the questions that we need to answer here in order to make a real impact, they're not that complicated, right? And so there's really 2 reasons that have held back progress in this space. One is a persistent sex bias in biomedical research. So until very recently, most researchers in the US didn't have to include both males and females in their studies. That's changed, which is great. But we have preclinical research spanning 100 years that was conducted mostly in male animals, and that was done primarily because the ovulatory cycles, the hormonal cycles that females undergo, were considered noisy, that they would mess up the data. So this is changing, but there's really just a lack of information that we have about how reproductive decline occurs and why it occurs in females. And having this neglect essentially has pretty much long disadvantaged women, and it's made us really blind to some of the vulnerabilities that specifically affect females. So, for example, 80% of the drugs that have been pulled from the market due to safety concerns were because of adverse effects in women. So there's really been a systemic sex bias in research, and that is changing, which is great. But we need to catch up in terms of doing the research to understand the specifics of female physiology. The other piece of this is that research on women's health in general has been really underfunded historically. This is the budget for the NIH, which is the largest biomedical research funding body in the United States for 2018. And what you can see is that about 15% of the budget went to all of women's health. So that would be from birth through death. And of that, we found about 43 million that year that had been devoted to projects on reproductive aging in women. And that's, barely a fraction. I mean, it's almost nothing. It's like a rounding error. And so, without funding, it's really impossible to do the science. And scientists are really the heroes of this field. And so, this is an area that really deserves and needs a lot more funding. This is changing. So these numbers are from 2018. In 2020, the National Institute on Aging had their first call for grants in the space, which is really an amazing step forward. It wasn't very much money, but I think there's a lot of focus now that's being brought to this space, and it's way overdue. There's also a strong economic cost for menopause and for this reproductive decline in women. The numbers are expected to be over 1 billion women who are actively in menopause by 2025. That's pretty soon. And there's, the associated healthcare costs from all of those increased risks that I described earlier. There's also a really dramatic economic cost for lost productivity from the vasomotor symptoms that are associated with menopause, which can last anywhere from 1 to 10 years. And those include things like brain fog, hot flashes. And, we often brush those to the side, but these are things that dramatically impact a woman's quality of life. So, what we've been trying to do at the Buck Institute is to reframe the narrative around female reproductive longevity. I mentioned earlier that we don't understand where along the woman's reproductive span trajectory things go wrong. But this is what we want to figure out. And the goal would be, at a minimum, to understand where the causal cues are so that we can try to intervene and change the number of quality eggs that a woman has when she's in midlife so that we can push out the age of menopause. We can extend a woman's health span and potentially also extend her fertility. So there are two different reproductive longevity initiatives that we have at the Buck that I want to describe. One is a center that's physically at the Buck. The other is a global consortium. And so the center was started with a grant and really a visionary idea from Nicole Shanahan to nucleate a group of faculty at the Buck Institute, where we're already studying all aspects of aging biology, to nucleate a group that would be focused specifically on female reproductive longevity. And so we did that. We opened the doors in 2019. You can see the members here. Francesca Duncan, Polina Lishko, who both have labs at other institutions, but have a footprint at the Buck Institute, my lab. Dina Amira, who's a reproductive biologist. She's an evolutionary biologist, actually, and she studies the evolution of the female sex, which is fascinating, but a topic for another day. When we opened the center, it became clear to us pretty quickly that if we wanted to make an impact in this space, that we were going to have to do something much bigger. This area has been underfunded and understudied for so long that, in order to move the needle, in order to make a real mark, we needed to do something bigger. And that's where this global consortium came from. So I co-founded with the help from the Bia Echo Foundation and Nicole Shanahan, the Global Consortium for Reproductive Longevity and Equality in 2020. And the goal of this consortium is truly to build the field. We want to build the ecosystem around reproductive longevity and to really accelerate translating basic science discoveries from the lab bench into women's hands faster. And that can mean products, it can mean diagnostics, it can mean therapeutics, everything and anything. And part of what I'm trying to do as we're building up this field is to bring every single person who has an interest in the space. And that includes not just scientists, but also clinicians. This is an area of science where the dialogue between clinicians and basic researchers is so, so vital. But also people who might be in this audience. So funders, people in biotech, pharma, literally anyone who has an interest so that we can move things forward faster. I think we have to build a network of people who are going to promote like a collaborative dialogue to move things forward. And this is a little bit of a busy slide, but this encapsulates really all of the things that we're trying to do. So if our goal is to solve ovarian aging, then we really need to engage an army, not just of creative scientists, but also of entrepreneurs, of advocates, of people who are going to help us with this paradigm shift. And the consortium's role, from my perspective, is to just foster these interactions, to foster and galvanize and organize people to work together. And the biggest gap that we saw that we could fill right away was funding. So we fund grants to scientists all over the world. We also put together some resources online that we're currently building for communication and for resources in terms of information. We built the world's first ovarian biology core facility, which I'll describe in a moment. And for our grantees and for our center members, we put together a translational advisory board full of experts and heavy hitters from pharma and the VC world, so that when we see things that are translatable coming out of our grantee labs or our center labs, we can immediately help the PI move things away from the lab and into the clinic. So we gave away our first grants in 2020 to 23 scientists all over the world. We implemented a really, I think, innovative granting system where we have a blind review step that gets rid of any institutional or gender bias. And as a result, more than 80% of our grantees happen to be women. And we are covering a lot of different kinds of topics. You can go to GCRLE.org if you want to see the kinds of grants that we funded. But we're trying to cover as wide a space as we can, because we don't know where those causal cues or factors are going to be found. And so we want to see discovery in as many areas and as many places as we can. And like I said, at the Buck, we built the first ovarian biology core facilities. This would be like a genomics core or a sequencing facility or something like that that does biology on ovaries and in humans and in rodents and in non-human primates. And the goal here is really to lower the barrier to entry for scientists coming from outside the space, because we want to attract as many creative people who are already established as we can. And hopefully soon we'll have 1-week boot camps where people can send their trainees to learn those techniques and then bring them back to their home labs. We also planted a second center in Asia, the Asia Center for Reproductive Longevity and Equality. And the goal here is really to stimulate this work on another continent. And it brings together a group of scientists who are really have a lot of expertise on the clinical side. We also have the first ever international conference on reproductive aging in June, and we'll have this conference every year going forward. I'm really proud of this photo because, when we started, there weren't very many people working at this interface, and now there's just been a huge amount of interest, and as you can see, there's just a lot of really wonderful people here. And so our goal is to keep bringing together all of these people so that we can have a sustainable global community. And so, if you're interested, we'll be doing this again in May of 2023. I also mentioned we put together this knowledge hub, and this is a work in progress, but our goal really is to give not just scientists and clinicians, but also women who are looking for trusted information on the web. Sometimes I think women's health is like playing Russian roulette. It depends on which doctor's office you walk into, whether you're going to get good treatment. And it also depends on which website you happen to click on, whether you're going to get information that has been really vetted by experts. And so we're seeking to provide evidence-based information. And some of that will include analysis of the current information, the most cutting edge research that's happening, but distilled down and translated for a basic audience, people who aren't experts. So this is a slide that just really summarizes what I just told you, but these are the kinds of things that we're building. I think the only thing I didn't mention here is we put together a clinical advisory board to help us author some of those resources for physicians. We have to change the medical school curriculum because part of the shortfall right now is that the training isn't there. So we want to help provide people who are going through medical training as much information as they can get about reproductive aging, about women's health, and about menopause. We also just recently started a biobank for discarded eggs and tissue at the center so that we can have this resource for scientists to access the material they need to do the research. The round 2 grants are coming soon, and we're going to be giving away grants every single year going forward. And this will happen. The number of grants that we can give away is completely dependent upon how much money we can raise. And so one of the things that I would ask people in this audience, let me tell you one more thing. I just wanted to say, for those of you who have an entrepreneurial spirit in the audience, there's a huge market here for menopause treatment. There have not been as many startups as you might imagine for something that's affecting half the population. That's changing. There's a crop of companies that are coming up that are really exciting. I will say that there are very few companies that are really working on interventions and therapeutics. Most of these things are treating the symptoms, but not the cause of reproductive decline. And that is not because we don't have the will. It's simply because there is no IP. There's very little IP in the space because we haven't done the experiments and the research to to make those discoveries. And so that's why we're focusing entirely on funding academic science right now. And I imagine that in the 3 to 5 year time frame, that might shift, that we might, shift some of our resources towards company building and early stage accelerators at some point. But right now, our focus is 100% on academic science. I will also say just one last thing, because I know I'm talking to a lot of longevity minded folks, is that ovarian aging, ovaries give us a really interesting model. You could think about it a little bit as an accelerated model for aging in a human. And I often trying to plant the seed that you could think about ovaries for clinical trials, potentially for longevity interventions in humans, using the ovaries as a proxy for longevity. We know that the compounds that potentially have a positive effect on aging in the rest of the body also have a positive effect on aging in the ovaries, and things like rapamycin and NAD boosters and metformin. So, you could imagine doing a clinical trial that would be very short in a young female, which would have endpoints that measure things like pregnant, not pregnant, hormone levels, bone density, relatively easy metrics. So I'm not saying this will necessarily work, but I just want to plant that seed because I think it's really something worth pursuing. Um, and finally, I would encourage you to go to our website if you're interested in joining us. We need ambassadors. We want people to be talking about this at the dinner table. We want this to be in front of mind for every person out there. So we have a website, we have a white paper. If you're interested in donating so that we can give away more grants, there's a QR code here and it's also on our website. And so I want to thank the BioEcho Foundation. They have been our seed funders, and we're really prescient in understanding that this is such an important area to invest in. We definitely need more funders, though. So if you know any philanthropically minded people who have an interest in the space, I would love to talk to them. And I didn't talk about work in my lab, but these are my lab members. I will thank Nick Gentry and Alison Rodriguez, who are the people who work with me at GCRLE. And finally, this is adjacent to what I was talking about, but I just wanted to put it out there. We are restarting the MBL Biology of Aging course next summer. So this is an advanced research training course for students and PhD students and postdocs. And it's really meant to train the next generation of leaders in the field. So the applications will open in late 2022, so in a few months. We have a Twitter feed and we'll be advertising this more broadly, but I wanted to put this on everyone's radar for next summer. And that's it. So I'll stop sharing and hopefully answer some questions.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much. This was a ton of information. And yeah, you're working on so many different fronts. Thank you for sharing. I would be grateful if you could send the tweet links, for example, either in this chat or share them with us so we can actually make sure the group gets them.
Absolutely. I'll put it in the chat link right now. Let me just exit out of my...
Wonderful. And this is opening up for questions and discussions. As usual, the algorithm is I talk until you stop me by raising your hand. And I have a few, general questions that we often ask, which is for someone new entering the field, and I know that I could piggyback off the last slide that you showed. What do you recommend someone going in, maybe specifically in reproductive longevity? Are there any specific hunches where you're like, we need much more of this particular research?
I think, for reproductive longevity, I think, I often show a slide which has a list of questions on it. So I mentioned the first one, which I think is the most important. That is just to really understand the underlying causal cues for reproductive decline. But this question of why human females undergo menopause at all, since it's not a common feature of mammals or of any animal, why that happens is kind of a mystery. This question of why reproductive span correlates with overall lifespan, I think, is fascinating. There's also, I didn't mention this, but there's also this observation that age at menopause or reproductive span is incredibly variable at the level of the individual. So normal menopause spans something like 14 years, which is crazy if you think about it. And so understanding why the age of menopause varies so much between individuals, I think would give us a lot of really important insights into, what those causal factors are. I also think in terms of very tractable problems that we can solve quickly, I think trying to find better biomarkers and putting together better diagnostics for women that would give an individual woman a really clear snapshot of where she is in that reproductive span trajectory. Because on average, it's this thing with a single, like one curve with a single inflection point in a cliff. But at the level of individuals, reproductive health, reproductive biology is so variable. And, giving women the knowledge and power to understand just where they are in that trajectory would be so valuable. So that's probably more than one answer, but
Yeah, thank you. That's super useful. The list of questions would certainly also be really interesting to have. We already have a few questions. One is from Creon and then Anna.
Hi there, can you hear me?
I can hear
Yep.
you.
Great. So thanks for an amazing presentation. I might have missed this. I actually have two short questions. First one is, what is your opinion on modern, but like traditional, not experimental, modern hormone replacement therapy for perimenopausal women? What's the state of the art, and is it useful? And then secondly is, if you mind speculating on what are some of the natural selection arguments for menopause? Is there like an individual selection argument, a group selection argument? Has anybody done cool work on that? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so to start with the first one, I think hormone replacement therapy is by far the best band-aid that we have for treating women who are in perimenopause and menopause. So for those of you who aren't super familiar with it, hormone replacement therapy is simply taking usually a combination of 2 or 3 of those ovarian hormones and putting them back, basically resupplying them through either a patch or a gel to women to try to mimic the things that are lost when ovaries stop working. So typically it's a combination of estrogen and progestin. I think the way that HRT is administered right now is primitive at best in most cases, and that there's a huge amount of room for optimization. And I think this is a place where we can actually make a lot of progress just by thinking a little bit more carefully about how we administer this therapy. So I need to be fully transparent. I am not an MD, I'm a PhD, so I'm not giving any medical advice. But one of the reasons that I am a science advisor for Evernow, which is a company that does telemedicine HRT for women, is that they're willing to think with me about how to personalize the treatment. So a lot of times HRT is administered kind of like a sledgehammer. So it's like one size fits all. And, like I said before, reproductive physiology in women is one of the most multivariate signatures in all of human health. And we need to treat it that way. And so this is a place where individualized, personalized medicine is going to be very powerful. So for HRT, for example, you would want to personalize not just the dose for a woman, but also think about the relative amounts of things that are in that dose and maybe add in a few other things, because your ovaries make probably at least a dozen, probably a lot more things that are really important, these circulating factors. And for example, testosterone, low dose testosterone for women is really important for sexual health. So you could imagine adding that in. There's other hormones that you could imagine adding in. So there's a lot of room for innovation here and optimization. And I actually did a whole webinar on this. And the focus of that webinar was really to talk through the historic, I guess, there's been a taboo really, and kind of like a black curtain that was drawn over HRT by a study that was published in the early 90s, or actually was done in the 90s and published in 2002, called the Women's Health Initiative. And unfortunately, that one paper, which was, it was flawed in many ways, but the message that was amplified by the press when it was published was just wrong. It really hurt a whole generation of women because doctors pulled women off of HRT. And the thing about HRT is that it's important for maintaining heart health. It's important for maintaining bone health. And there's a window of opportunity for starting HRT, which if you go too far past menopause, it's no longer beneficial. And so it's so important for women to evaluate their individual health and risk factors with their doctor and decide whether or not HRT is right for them very close to when they're going through menopause. I could talk about this for a long time, but I'll direct you to the webinar, and I'm happy to answer follow-up questions on this. For your second question, thinking about the evolution of menopause is fascinating. And again, I'm not an expert in the space, and I won't pretend to be, but I did also do a webinar with Dina Amira, who is the evolutionary biologist that we hired into the center. So Dina has studied the evolution of the female physiology for her whole career. She studied the evolution of pregnancy and the evolution of menstruation for her PhD and her postdoc, and now she's focusing on the evolution of menopause. And she has just finished writing a book, a popular science book about the evolution of the female body, which will be published in early 2023. So stay tuned for that. But, I think what I can say is that, there are aspects of the grandmother hypothesis that are probably going to be important when you think about the evolution of menopause. But that's probably not the only explanation, and that it might not be fully, it might not have all the features necessary to explain why human females evolved to go through menopause. There's also this really intriguing idea that humans as placental mammals have the most invasive placenta by far of any mammal, any mammalian species. And that conflict really between mother and fetus probably plays into the reason that we go through menopause. But it definitely doesn't have anything to do with like the age or the overall lifespan or of the animals. Whales are long-lived, that's true, but that's really not the reason. But again, I would direct you to someone who's a little bit more of an expert on this than me.
Wow, wonderful. Yeah, you already see in the chat people are looking vicariously for the videos.
So let me type her name in there. Yeah.
So cool. I'm super looking forward to this book.
Oh yeah, I'm so excited about it too. She shared the cover art with me the other day.
Very cool.
I'll link to the webinars too here.
Thank you. That would be wonderful. Okay, next one up we have Anar.
I'm not hearing. Hello.
You are unmuted, Anar. Oh, yeah. Here you go.
Yeah.
I have a quick question if Anar is at the restroom or something.
Go for it, Joe.
Okay.
Yeah.
One was, this is very quick offhand. Is that fetus mother competition thing also related to do humans have more gestational diabetes? And the other is there a correlation between age of menarche, which seems to have some lifelong health and longevity effects, and age of menopause?
Yeah. So to your first question, I don't know. I think, I don't know the answer to that.
I just heard that it is also related to the sort of evolutionary game theory of competition between fetus and mother?
Yeah, so there's a lot there, and Dina has a lot to say on this. And I, I think what I take away from everything that I've learned so far about evolution in this question is that it's probably some combination of ideas, and that there's not one that really in a satisfying way explains all the aspects of menopause that we observe in human females. So it's probably some combination of things. Um, and sorry, what was the second
Oh,
question?
so is there a correlation between age and
Oh, yes. So that's a really fascinating question. And there's data, you can find data in both directions. So so I think the jury's out. I suspect that there will be. But again, the age at menarche is influenced by so many different things that we know about. And I guess the same is true for menopause. And so while there might be I guess the way I think about it is that while there might be a signal there, it could get lost in an individual depending on how many other factors are influencing both of those transitions. So I guess this just comes back to the idea that reproductive physiology is incredibly complex, and it's so in both at both of those transitions, environment plays such a key role in what's happening and can really move things. It's complicated.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Wonderful. We'll try Anna again, who's exited and entered. Let's see if your audio works.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Wonderful.
Can you hear me?
So
Yeah, good enough.
Kind of.
Try your question. Let's see.
Hello?
Hi.
Can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me?
Sort of.
A little bit. How
Hello?
about you just message me your question and I'll ask it.
Sounds good. Sorry about that.
No worries. All good. I do think usually face-to-face interactions are the nicest, but if it doesn't work, I'm happy to stand in and ask it. Okay, cool. So we already discussed a little bit like undervalued areas that you want to draw people's attention to or like new researchers' attention to. Could you give us a little bit of a carrot of if things go well, where could we be in like 5 or 10 years? Like what's kind of like a great goal to work towards? Is there anything that's particularly exciting? That a goal that people can get behind, and it's okay if it's a bit speculative. I think people understand that with that wanting in place, but I think it's always cool to have like something hopeful or optimistic in mind as we chart this pretty undervalued path.
Yeah, I agree. I do think in the short term and that like certainly in the next 5 years, we should have much better diagnostic tools. Right now, it's it's primitive the way that we assess women's health. We take temperatures, we take like really static snapshots of what is an incredibly dynamic process. If a woman wants to have her hormone levels checked, typically doctors will have them do a blood test at like day 2 of their cycle, which is crazy because what is day 2 of my cycle? It's totally different from day 2 of your cycle. The 28-day cycle is complete myth. Like less than 15% of cycles are 28 days long. So day 2 for me is something completely different on that trajectory than day 2 for you. But moreover, this static snapshot really doesn't capture this dynamic information. So there's a huge opportunity. I also did a whole webinar about this, just speaking to entrepreneurs. There's a huge opportunity to develop a women's reproductive health diagnostic panel that should be, it should be a standard of care. It should be included in a woman's annual, OBGYN appointment, along with all the other standard tests that we do. So I have high hopes that will come online soon. That requires 2 pieces of innovation that are extremely tractable. One is we need to have a better way to measure as many of those hormones as possible at as high a resolution as possible. So every day or every other day. And of course, you can't do that. You can't take that much blood from someone. So there are ways to do this through like urine spot assays, but right now they're very, very expensive because the modality they're using for the measurement is mass spec. So I think, I've even talked to some early stage founders who have ideas around how to change that technology so that you could get, 1 or 2 months of resolution here. But to combine that with not just measuring of hormones, but to combine that with thinking about a woman's body as a holistic whole, and thinking about like the eggs aren't changing that much over time. What's changing is the environment around the eggs. And so, you could think a lot about trying to optimize every part of the system, and the system being a woman's whole body, so that diagnostic health panel would have measures that represent every organ system and every aspect of health and aging that we care about, things like immune function and metabolic function, et cetera, et cetera. There is an opportunity there for someone who wants to do this in a thoughtful way. And then I think maybe a little bit more long-term, but also tractable, is really getting much better, higher resolution data. We just don't have longitudinal data on women who from, like 30 through 50. We don't have that longitudinal monitoring, and it's happening now, right? There's so many companies that have popped up. There's a lot of even academic labs that are now starting to do long-term longitudinal studies, and apps that track cycles and things like that are generating huge amount of data, which I think AI and people who are more computationally minded, I hope, will be able to find signatures that will again feed back into this diagnostic and biomarker space. I think defining a clock for reproductive decline is something that we can do and that we should do. And again, these aren't therapeutic interventions, but that knowledge is power for a woman to understand where she is in her individual trajectory. Then on the more aspirational side, but I also think very tractable, is to understand, what are those drivers of ovarian senescence? How do the pathways that we already know about that are important for aging in other tissues, like mitochondrial function and metabolism and things like that, impact ovaries? I'm obviously very biased, but I think that that causal cue for menopause really originates in the brain and in that dialogue between brain and ovary. And so making some progress on identifying those factors and understanding how they change is probably going to be really important. There's also this really tantalizing work that's going on right now in several labs to understand how gut microbiome impacts aging. So it turns out that in women, the levels of circulating estrogen are governed by gut microbiome. There are microbes that express enzymes that can modify estrogen to either put it back into the circulation or make it so that it's excreted. And so, of course, the woman has to produce the estrogen, but the actual amount of estrogen that's present is totally governed by her gut microbiome. So there's a lot of interesting things happening there. I also think that in the next 5 years, we'll have much better models to study this. We don't have great animal models of menopause because, mice, for example, don't enter menopause. So we funded a lot of grants to try to find new models. So I feel like I'm on a little bit of a monologue here. I'll stop talking.
No, you're on a roll. Great. This is really cool. I mean, it's crazy how much info there is if you look just under the surface, and just how surprising much of this is. Okay, we have a ton more questions. Let's see how many we can get through in rapid fire. I'm going to start with Anar's question, which is that I'm assuming that him and his company are getting ready to launch a clinical trial of rapamycin and or NAD plus impact on outcomes for women with premature ovarian failure or low ovarian reserve. Would love to hear your thoughts on this at some point.
Oh, yeah. So one of the grants we funded was to Yushin Su's lab at Columbia. And she has a preprint out that is the result of that funding, where she did the first really comprehensive single cell characterization of ovarian tissue from humans at different ages. And it's beautiful work. And some of the things that she found are really, I think so impactful because the standard in the field before this was a beautiful paper that was doing single cell sequencing from rhesus macaques. And that data at the time it was published, that was kind of the bleeding edge of what was possible in terms of the technology. And they profiled something like 2,000 cells. Well, it turns out that, Yusha was able to profile, orders of magnitude more. And what she found is that a lot of the conclusions they reached were not quite right because, they undersampled. And so what they were measuring was really kind of noise. And so anyway, the Yushin, I don't know if this person is in Yushin's lab or working with Yushin, but they have now funding to do these phase 1 clinical trials with ovarian endpoints for rapamycin, which is great. We also funded a grant to Mary Zielinski at the Oregon Primate Research Center to do rapamycin studies in rhesus macaques with ovarian endpoints. And so those experiments, she's about 1.5 years into those. And so, it's a beautiful experiment because she's able to take an ovary at the beginning and then do the treatment and then take the ovary at the end so that you have a really great control. So same animal to see really at a really dramatic resolution in a way that we won't be able to necessarily characterize in humans yet, to see what's happening in terms of whether or not, it really benefits ovarian function. So yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, Gail, you're next.
Great. Jennifer, fascinating work. Let me just touch my questions about something that you mentioned here in passing about starting HRT, getting continued benefits, cardiovascular, et cetera, benefits, stopping HRT, or never beginning it, and then at the time of menopause, perimenopause, bringing it in later, not seeing the benefits. So what that would seem to indicate from a life extension, longevity, and health perspective is there is some active factor that as long as you keep it going, some biochemical mechanism, as long as you keep it going, you're maintaining youth span. But now it seems to shut off and you can't reactivate it by simply giving, by restoring certain sorts of conditions. The critical question could be, what is that factor? And that could, of course, end up implicating both genders. Any idea? I mean, that's any idea of what that is, or is that a target for investigation?
Those are, I would say, maybe two questions together. And I think for HRT, what happens is, your ovaries are making like this whole like beautiful cocktail that's important for general health, for overall health. This cocktail of chemicals. And the ones that we know about that people are most familiar with are estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, but there's many others. And HRT, like I said, typically replaces estrogen and progesterone. What happens, these are circulating factors. And so you have the chemical, whatever it is, let's just say estrogen in this case. But estrogen by itself doesn't actually do anything. There's two pieces to the equation. So you have the signal, but then you also need the receiver. And the receiver is going to be on the cell surface or in the cells that are primed to receive that message. And it gets more complicated than that. I'm talking about this at kind of a cartoonish level, but for estrogen, for example, it has 3 different kinds of receivers that can be expressed in different tissues at different times at different levels. But in order for the message to be received, you need those receivers. We call them receptors. And what happens is when a woman goes through menopause and her ovaries stop making estrogen, those receptors on the target tissues, they get downregulated. And eventually they stop being expressed. And they're not going to come back, unfortunately, if you add back estrogen too late. And that's why there's this window of opportunity. So, if you look in the literature, somewhere around 6 years, certainly 10 years is, you can have a detrimental effect if you try to add back HRT 10 years after menopause without ever having had it. But there does seem to be a window of opportunity for starting HRT to have those beneficial effects. And it's really about downregulation of the receptors. And that's going to be true for all of those hormones. Now, is there a cue the cue that I'm talking about is the causal the thing that causes reproductive decline. So that's something that's probably happening earlier. And one of the downstream effects of that cue is going to be that ovaries stop producing these hormones. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, it does completely. Yeah, but so then when
Gail, unfortunately, we're at the end of the hour. And I do want to leave just, as we hit almost the 31 mark, just 1 minute to ask you, Jennifer, the final question, which is famous plug moment. If people in this group are excited about work, what can they do to help you along? You already had a little bit on a slide there, but like this is the moment where people have a good summary, I think, to work from.
Yeah, I mean, what can they do to help me personally? Nothing, but they can help me fund the consortium. I mean, really, like I said, we're giving away grants. I really think that this is, in this moment, I think that the way we can make the most progress is to fund the researchers who are making the discoveries and to give them as much runway as possible. So one of the things that I've thought a lot about recently, and particularly because I've been having these conversations for a while now, for years now, with funders, with people who have an interest in commercialization and in translation, and there are a lot of really people who have really the right motivation, who are kind of going off in the wrong direction in a way because they don't understand how science funding works. And from my perspective, of course, science funding is totally broken, but just throwing more money at the problem actually isn't going to move the needle. There's an aspect to it that I think people miss, which is that sustainable funding is maybe the best thing you can do for an academic researcher, right? Because what happens when I'm trying to fund my lab is I have this patchwork of grants that are for different amounts of money and over different time. And I'm constantly trying to plug holes to make sure that I can fund my lab. And so what that means is that I'm constantly pivoting what I work on or the research questions I ask to fit the grant calls. And so we had the first call for grants. A lot of our researchers actually had to close their labs during COVID. And so, they're okay for now. But what I want to do is have the consortium have two arms. One that's funding new grants because we want to continue to bring in new people. And part of the grants that we fund are to postdoctoral researchers so we can grow the next generation of leaders. But I also want to have an arm of the funding that is for sustainable funding so that people who already have money from us can apply. If they're doing something that's impactful and that's moving forward, we want them to be able to continue on that path and not have to just stop and try to get another grant somewhere else that may or may not, really fit what they really want to do. Because, the way we do it now, the incentives we have for scientists are, they essentially reinforce incremental, not creative, not long-term work. And what we want is for someone to really go after a question and to take whatever path they need to when they see the data to get to the answer and to be as creative and as risk-taking as they need to be. So that's what I would say is we're trying to put in place a model for sustainable funding. And in this moment and for the next few years, I would implore you to think about funding basic science. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's already a comment in the chat of just yes, sustainable funding and leading a nonprofit institute. I can certainly just echo this. It takes a lot of overhead to go after individual grants and to tailor things towards them. Okay, well, thank you, Jennifer, so much for joining. This was absolutely wonderful. And yeah, thanks a lot for the work and for putting this on the map. It's really.
Yeah. I'm putting this is my lab website. And this is the GCRLE website. So my lab website has a section that has links to all those webinars. I think they're also on the GCRLE.org website, but please feel free to reach out to me. I'll also type my email address here. I'm happy to talk to anyone. I'm happy to give these talks to anyone who might be interested. Yeah.
Well, thanks a ton for the service that you're doing.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Really, really excited for what's going to come out of this in a few years. And please do share any updates that you have on upcoming grants and so forth, so we can reshare them in our network. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, sorry, I see there's a lot of still questions in the chat. There is a network discussion forum on GCRLE.org. If anyone wants to continue this discussion, like go put your questions there and we'll answer them.
Okay, great. Good. Then we can go over there. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Lovely to have you all on, and I can't wait to see you for the next one.